Good afternoon, everyone. This is Pastor Anderson with another study from the book of Genesis this afternoon. Today we're doing chapter 41, which will be a lot less controversial than the past chapters that we have been going through. We're going to get back to the Joseph story this afternoon. He is down in Egypt. Remember, we left him at the end of chapter 40 in prison. The chief cupbearer was supposed to remember Joseph to Pharaoh, but totally forgets about that. And 2 years is going to go by before another man's dream is going to give Joseph the opportunity to get out of prison. But before we dive into all of that, let's go ahead and begin, as we always do, with a word of prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, open now your word to us, that as we read and study the book of Genesis, we would be led to a greater understanding of you and all that you have done for your faithful people. We pray all these things in the name and for the sake of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Let's dive right in. Chapter 41 of Genesis, beginning with verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and strode by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows. And Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So the account of Pharaoh's dreams, the 2 dreams, are rather similar. In each case, a plump, fat, healthy thing is swallowed by a lean, evil, unhealthy thing. The cows by the Nile is an especially important dream because cows were not just kind of the typical livestock animal in the nation of Egypt. They actually were a symbol for the entire nation. And so the second dream, going with heads of grain, Egypt had a huge grain industry as well. So these would have both been recognizable things to Pharaoh as things that connect to the nation as a whole, which means he knows something is going on here. He knows that this is bad news for either him as the ruler or for the entire nation of Egypt. That's why when he awakes in the morning, he is troubled. And what does he do? He summons the entire wisdom of Egypt. This is the magicians and all of the other wise men. We could call them wise guys. This was a special class of priests whose job it was to interpret dreams like this because they were believed to be closer to the gods. They received special understanding from the gods and could then impart that to Pharaoh and to the common people. And so it is their job to interpret dreams of this nature, and they can't do it. It doesn't tell us exactly why they cannot interpret. We know that they can't interpret it because they aren't connected to the one true God who is the only one who gives interpretations, which we will see with Joseph later on. But we don't know if maybe they thought they knew, but were too scared to tell Pharaoh the bad news, or what it was. Either way, these magicians are not wise enough to interpret these dreams. But then the chief cupbearer, conveniently 2 years after the fact, remembers Joseph. Joseph is now the Hebrew slave who is down in that prison in the house of the captain of the guard. Where the cupbearer and the baker were 2 years ago. Joseph interpreted their dreams, and then it came to pass exactly that way. And so the cupbearer doesn't actually say, hey, you should summon Joseph in order to have him interpret your dream because he'll be able to. He kind of lets Pharaoh make that connection himself. But we can tell that because Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream correctly, we should expect that God will also help Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dreams correctly. And that's exactly what's going to happen. So we continue with the next section, beginning at verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I had never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. Then I awoke. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. Famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So at the suggestion of the chief cupbearer, Pharaoh summons Joseph, but before Joseph comes into Pharaoh's presence, he has a fundamental change take place. His physical appearance is going to change quite a bit. Hebrew men in these days would have had decently long hair, a little bit longer than mine is now, and a significantly long beard. Joseph is only 30 years old at this point, but you can imagine that he's been in prison for 2 years. He hasn't had the opportunity to shave or clean himself in any sense. So he would have looked rather scraggly. Egyptian men, on the other hand, were completely clean shaven. They have no facial hair, and their heads are completely bald. This is just the Egyptian custom. And so we'll see that when Joseph comes out of prison, he is going to become like an Egyptian. His appearance is going to fundamentally change so that he looks different. His head is shaved, his beard is gone. He now looks very much like the rest of the Egyptians around him. This will become important later on because when the brothers show up in our next week's study, when the brothers show up to come get food in Egypt, they don't recognize Joseph because of the way he looks. He just looks like an Egyptian. And so this is kind of, in a sense, Joseph is separating a bit from his past and moving forward into a new identity as an Egyptian. And so then he comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh recounts to him the dreams. You'll note that as Pharaoh recounts the dreams, he places a little more emphasis on the eating or the negative cow, the lean cows and the scorched grains eating up the other ones. For example, in verse 20, Pharaoh emphasizes that the thin, ugly cows ate up the 7 plump cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. This will form an important detail in Joseph's interpretation later on, where Joseph tells Pharaoh, hey, you've had these 2 dreams, but they have one meaning. It's the Lord telling you what he's about to do in 2 different ways. And the reason that there are 2 dreams is because the matter is fixed. God intends to do this very, very soon. Now think back a little bit in the book of Genesis to chapter 37. When we first met Joseph, Joseph was a dreamer, and he had 2 dreams himself about sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf, and the sun, moon, and the stars bowing down to him. And these were interpreted by Joseph as dreams that one day he would be prominent, and all of his brothers and sisters and his father and mother would bow down to him and his authority. That's ultimately what got him cast into the pit and sold into slavery, was resentment over that dream and its interpretation. But if we know that 2 dreams here mean that it is fixed by God and God is going to bring it about soon, we think back to Joseph's 2 dreams and we can say the same thing. That soon, that moment where all of his brothers and all of his family bow down to Joseph's authority, that is going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. So keep that in mind as we continue through Genesis. And so Joseph lays out the interpretation. There are 7 years of plenty that have kind of already begun. And then after that, there will be 7 years of famine. And the famine will be so severe that we will forget the 7 years of plenty. It's going to be excessive. And so we need to prepare. And Joseph not only gives Pharaoh an interpretation of the dream, he also goes on to kind of give Pharaoh some advice about what to do about it. This is the whole idea that he gives starting in verse 34, that Pharaoh should appoint people over the land. He should pick a wise man over all of the land of Egypt. They're going to gather all of the food, 1/5 of the produce of the land during the 7 plentiful years. If the years were as plentiful as the dreams indicate, 1/5, 20% is not that much, and it's going to help them later on when they have nothing in the famine. And so the plan is they're going to get this guy with these overseers under him, and they're going to be in charge of storing up food in all of the storehouses in the cities of Egypt, and then they will be a reserve for the people during the years of famine. Notice that Joseph never says, hey, you should appoint me as this ruler over Egypt, but he strongly implies it. And we're going to let Pharaoh come to his own conclusion. And that's what happens in the next section, which begins with verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. So Pharaoh likes Joseph's suggestion. And he says, well, we're not going to find a guy as wise and discerning as you, because you are the one who God has given the ability to interpret dreams. So why don't you be this guy in charge of the grain gathering operation? That's exactly what happens. Pharaoh gives Joseph all of the authority. He gives him the signet ring, which was the ring that had Pharaoh's seal on it, meaning that Joseph could actually make decisions on behalf of Pharaoh. He dresses him in royal garb, fine linen, and this gold chain around his neck. He causes him to ride in the second chariot in command, so to speak, which is important because nobody else in Egypt knows who in the world Joseph is. Remember, Joseph is a foreigner. He came to Egypt as a slave. So even though he looks like an Egyptian, nobody has any idea who this guy is. And so Pharaoh kind of gives Joseph a welcome introductory parade and parades him around all of the land of Egypt so that people bow the knee and realize that this man now has the authority of Pharaoh. Joseph is not the Pharaoh of Egypt, but he is the top advisor, the second in command, if you want to use the term, the vice pharaoh, or the vice president, so to speak, of all of the land of Egypt. He has come a great ways since he was sold into slavery by his brothers 13 years ago. He's now second in command in the entire land of Egypt, which was the most powerful nation in the world at this point in history. He's doing well. The Lord is really blessing Joseph through this incident. In addition, Pharaoh also gives Joseph a wife, a woman named Asenath, who is the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. The city of On is what we now call the city of Heliopolis, which was the center of the Egyptian worship of the sun. For the Egyptians, the sun god Ra or Re or Amun Re was really, really important. He was their chief, most powerful god. So Joseph is married to the daughter of the priest of the most powerful god in Egypt. And it's interesting that Asenath is the daughter of Potiphar, the priest. Remember that Joseph, when he came into Egypt, was sold to a man named Potiphar, the captain of the guard. Now he is related by marriage to Potiphar, the priest of the most powerful god in Egypt. So not only does Joseph now have the appearance of an Egyptian, he's actually related to the Egyptians. And not just any Egyptians, but the priests of On, the most high god of them all. This doesn't make Joseph a worshiper of the sun or anything. He's just related by marriage. But he is really integrated into Egyptian culture and life at this point, which is important for when his brothers show up. It will explain why they can't recognize him at all. And so then the chapter ends with a discussion of what happens when the years of plenty come to an end. That begins at verse 50. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began to come as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So with this Egyptian woman, Asenath, Joseph has 2 sons. The firstborn son's name is Manasseh. The second is Ephraim. Remember those 2 sons, because that will be important later on in the account of Genesis and in the account of the Bible. For once the nation of Israel begins, and there are the 12 tribes of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh are both half tribes. And so together they kind of replace their father. There's no tribe called Joseph. There's a half tribe for each of these 2 sons. So even though they are born, in a sense, as Egyptians, they become heads of tribes in the nation of Israel. And when he is naming Ephraim, Joseph gives us a little insight into how he feels about all of these experiences that he's had in the land of Egypt. When he names Ephraim, he says that the name Ephraim means, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." So even in this time of prosperity, he's second in command of Egypt. He has this wife and 2 kids. He's got status and power and authority and wealth. He still longs to be back home, where his brothers, where his father, where his family, where his God's promise is. He is away from all of that. Even as he's doing well, his heart yearns to be back there with all of them. But in the meantime, he's got a job to do, a job that Pharaoh appointed him. And sure enough, as he had predicted through the Lord's guidance, the 7 years of plenty come to an end, and the 7 years of famine begin. And all of the Egyptians become hungry. They come to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "Go to Joseph, and he will tell you what you should do." And Joseph opens up the storehouses and gives freely. No. Joseph opens up all of the storehouses and sells to the Egyptians. And ultimately, he'll sell to the rest of the inhabitants of the world too. This is important because you can sell. If you're the only one with food, you can people will do whatever it takes to get it. He has the monopoly. But also, this is a way to kind of consolidate power so that people are coming to Joseph and then ultimately to Pharaoh for sustenance and food and guidance, and all of the power rests then with Pharaoh. This will become important later because we're not done in Egypt. We're going to stay in Egypt for many, many years, and Pharaoh later on will use this consolidated power to cause all of the land of Egypt to oppress and afflict the descendants of Jacob and Joseph and the Israelites, so that they become slaves in Egypt. So Joseph, in kind of an odd, ironic way, sets up the power structure that enables the enslavement of his own descendants. Until the time of the famine has come, all of the world now is in need of food. The Egyptians are coming to Joseph to buy food out of the storehouses, and all of the rest of the world will come too, including the rest of Joseph's family. Jacob himself is too old to travel, so he's going to send the brothers, at least most of the brothers, next time. And we're going to get, for the first time in 13 years, a confrontation between Joseph, the Egyptian overlord, and the sons of Israel. And we're going to see how those two clash after 13 years of separation. So look forward to that study next week. In the meantime, I invite you, as always, to comment, like, share your reactions and thoughts on the bottom of this video so we can continue to talk back and forth about God's Word. Coming up this week, look again for another Bible study tomorrow morning on the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, at least a portion of Matthew, chapter 12. And then again, Sunday morning, May 10th, you will get your standard worship service with the sermon, a children's message, and a study of the Gospel of John, also a portion of chapter 12. If you all have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me on those things. Otherwise, I pray for God's continued blessings and peace on all of you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.